Today you're going to learn how to create a form inside your website, and creating a form is something that is very useful, but probably not right now. The reason I say that is because forms are usually used when it comes to submitting data from the user. So let's say you have a website, you have a contact form, or you might have a login system or a sign-up form, where you can go in and you can type in your name and your username, your email, and then you can submit it. This is usually what we use forms for. So in a lot of cases, when it comes to actually using the data from the user, you do need to have another language, like for example, JavaScript or PHP or Python or something that can actually do something with this data. And at this point, a lot of people are probably considering clicking away from this video. And I just want to mention that it is important that you know how to create forms before you get to that part where you have to start learning PHP or JavaScript or Python or whatever. So once you get to the day where you actually learn how to do something with this data here, you don't sit there and you're like, oh, I'm completely oblivious to how to create a form. So as a web developer, you do need to learn how to create forms, since this is something that is required or at least expected of you as a web developer. So with that said, let's actually go ahead and learn how to create a form. So a form, like I said, is a way for users to write something into your website and actually submit some data. For example, if you have a login system, they can write in their name and their username and their address or something, personal information they need to submit in order to sign up into your website. Then you can do that using a form. The way you create a form is by going inside your website and you create a form tag. So in this case here, I'm just going to create a form and then autocomplete it. And then you can see we get this little action attribute. Now the action attribute is actually only one of two different attributes you need to have in order to do this properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a method attribute. Now the action is going to be the one that actually determines where you send this data to. So let's say the user types something inside this form and they need to send the data. Where do we send the data to? In most cases, we do actually send it to another page where we have some code that actually goes in, grabs the data and does something with it. For example, insert it into a database, so you actually have a user that signed up into the website, or maybe you have a contact form, so you need to send this as an email to someone. Then you can do that using this action here. In this example here, let's just go ahead and write example.html. And I do know that there's probably people sitting here saying, oh, well, Daniel, you don't send this to an HTML page. That doesn't make sense. You need to send it to a PHP file or something else. And you would be correct. But for now, let's just go ahead and write example.html so I can actually show you what exactly this does when we do submit it using a method. So inside the method, we can add two different values, either a get method or a post method. The rule of thumb here is if you want to add a get method, then it is going to be with data that has a purpose when it comes to showing it inside the URL. Because the main difference between a get and a post method is how safe it is to actually send. So a get method shows all the data inside the URL of the next page that we send them to. So inside the example.html, you can see all the data inside the URL. But if I were to include a post method instead, then we don't see the data inside the URL. There are other differences, for example, that you can add more characters when it comes to a post method than a get method. So, it's not the only thing. The main rule of thumb here is that if you don't have a reason to show the data inside the URL, then use a post method. A reason for using a get method would actually be if you have a URL that the user should be able to bookmark or something when you actually send them to that other page, because that is sometimes the case. Then the user won't actually be able to do that if you don't use a get method. So again, there's a couple of usages for each one of these, but typically we use a post method unless there's a reason to use a get method. For now, I'm going to put this one to get so you can actually see what I'm talking about once we do actually get to submit this form. So going on, we need to start talking a bit about the different input types we have. When it comes to creating a form, there's many different types of inputs that you can write inside a form. You can write a regular text area where you can write text inside of it. There's also radio buttons where you can go in and have these small circles where you can select one of these circles in order to send, whatever you selected. There's drop downs. There is a regular input, which is just a one row input where you can write text inside of it. There's a couple of different types. Now, I do also need to point one more thing out before we get started, which is we're not going to mess with any sort of styling until we're actually done showing you all these different input types, because it's going to get very messy if I mix in styling in between. And you may also notice that I actually commented out my reset style sheet. The reason I did this is because your reset style sheet, at least if you have the same one as me, by default goes in and messes with your inputs, which is really annoying. But basically what it allows for you to do is start completely off on a clean slate. So if I were to, for example, include a text area, we can't see the border or anything of this text area. It's still going to be in there inside the website, but we can't see it because the border and everything has no border. So the reset style sheet goes in and kind of messes with things for us. So at the beginning here, just comment it out, and then we can actually start, uncomment it and show you how to style it afterwards. So going inside the form, the first one I want to show you is going to be a regular input type. So I'm going to type input, tap, and then you can see we get this auto-completed input with a type set to text. Now a text input is exactly how it sounds like. It is a input where you can write text inside of it. And what you can do is you can add a couple of different attributes to this one. So the next one is I want to add a ID, and a ID, as we've talked about before, is a unique identifier, meaning that we can only have one ID name per page inside our website. So if I were to call this one first name, then I cannot take this ID and use it inside another element, because that is going to mess things up for us. So make sure you only have one ID with that particular name inside each element. The second one is going to be a name attribute, and a name attribute is how we're actually going to grab this data inside the next page called example.html once we submit the data. So it's very important that you have a name attribute, even though right now, since we don't know any sort of other programming language, we cannot really use this for anything, but it is important that you put it in here because it has to be grabbable so we can actually use the data for something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write first, just so we know that this is the first name. You could also write first name if you wanted to. Let's just go and do that. That might make a little bit more sense to people. We do also have one called a placeholder. Now, a placeholder is going to allow for us to put some default text inside this input that we can see when we don't have anything typed into the input. So just to kind of demonstrate what I mean, I can go and write first name. And if we were to do this, go inside the website, refresh it here, you can now see that we have an input that says first name inside the input. Let me actually go and zoom in for you so you can actually see it here. Let's also go and make the wrapper a little bit smaller. I think we should do that. There we go. Now you can see it. So inside of here, you can see we have first name, but as soon as I start writing something, it goes away. And that is what a placeholder is. If I were to go back inside, I can actually add a label inside my form. So if we were to create a label tag, you can see that we get a for attribute, which is very important because a label is especially made in order to make forms more accessible to people who might have a little bit difficulty using a screen. So if you have a screen reader or you have trouble clicking on things, then a label is going to help immensely for people who might want to use your form. So don't go in here and create a paragraph instead. Whenever you want to create something, you could go in here and say first name, just to tell the user that this is for the first name. So if we were to go in here, you can see, oh, so now we labeled it first name. However, if I were to click this, you can see nothing happens, which is a very important point when it comes to accessibility. So going in instead, we can create this label, and I can go and target one of these inputs down here using the ID. So if we were to include my first name ID inside the for and actually go inside the label and say first name, save this one, go inside the website, you're also going to notice it's going to move it next to instead. And if I click the first name, it is going to select my input. And that is very important for accessibility. Also, people who might have trouble seeing, who has screen readers, in order to read up to them what is inside a website, need to have a label instead of a paragraph, because the screen reader can actually read up a label, but it has trouble when it comes to a paragraph. So we need to make sure we write it like this by including a label. Now, the last thing I want to show you when it comes to these attributes is using a value. Now, a value is going to allow for you to actually insert some text inside this input at the start before the user has actually typed something. So if we were to actually write Daniel, save it, go back in here, refresh it, you can now see it says Daniel, even though I didn't actually type anything. So it's very important to note here that you can also include some data in here. If we were to delete this, you can see, oh, the placeholder pops up again. In some cases, adding this default value is something that is going to be useful. For example, if you have a user that submits some data, but something goes wrong, so you send them back to the form, in order for them not to have to retype everything, then you might want to do this so they don't have to retype their name and their address and all that stuff. But in this case here, let's just go ahead and remove it again because we don't actually need to have it. The next one we're going to talk about is going to be a text area. And it's very important to point out here that all these different attributes are going to be useful when it comes to all the different inputs. Just so you know that these are not just used for this particular input type, but it can actually be used for many of the other ones that we're talking about. So if I were to go down inside my text area, you can actually see that we get some default values here when I actually auto-complete it. We get a name, which we talked about already, which is going to be the identifier to grab the data on the next page. So we can actually say this one should be message. So we know this is where the user can type in a message, for example, for sending an email or something. We can also go and add an ID. So we can say message. Just like before, we can add a label to this if we wanted to. So we're just going to copy the label, paste it right above. And we can also include the message ID inside this label here and change the message to write something cool. And we're also going to go ahead and add a placeholder here just because we want to have something that is written inside. So I could, for example, say I want to have the user write a message. Now you're also going to notice that we have a column and a row attribute, which is something that we can use in order to define a size for this text area. Now, typically I like to go in and do it using CSS instead, since I like to use CSS in order to resize things. But just for now, let's go ahead and add this in and just see how this looks like. So if we were to save this, go inside my website, refresh it, you can now see that we have something going on here. At the moment, you can see that we have the first input that we created, but then the label for the second input is actually going next to it here. So in order to avoid that, let's go back in and actually go and create a break in between these inputs. So I'm going to create a break and I'm going to add 2 of them just to make sure that we have a little bit of spacing going on. So saving this, going inside the website, refreshing, you can now see that we have some breaks going on. Now, if you want any of these to go below the text inside the labels, then we can also go in and add a break right after the labels themselves. So we can do that if you wanted to. So just to show you, if I were to do that, go back inside the website, you can now see that we have it on the next line. Something worth mentioning here is that you can actually resize the text area. So whenever you want to type something, you can always resize it if you want to, have a little bit of a larger text area. And of course, if you were to go inside and actually change the columns and the rows, you can actually change the sizing. But like I said, usually when it comes to a text area, I like to use a piece of CSS code in order to actually do this. So instead of writing a column and a row, I would typically go in and say I want to add some style, which is a way for us to add CSS in line instead of having to do it inside a CSS file. So I can say we want to add a width, and I can set this one to 100%. So if we were to do this, go back inside the website, refresh it, you can now see that we have 100%. Of course, this is also going to do something about the height, but that is also something you can change. Now, I do want to do a little bit of CSS when it comes to this particular text area, because there is something here that is worth noting. So if I were to go ahead and just delete the styling that I included in line here, I can actually go inside my CSS file and just go to the bottom here and say I have a text area and I want to add some styling for it. So in this case here, I can go ahead and say that I want to include a width, which is going to be 100%, just like before. And I also want the resize ability to change. So right now we can resize both horizontally and vertically, but let's say I want to go in here and only want to do it horizontally. Then I can do that by going inside, refreshing the browser, and now we cannot do it up and down, but I can do it left and right. So we're going to go back in here. I can also do this vertically, save it, go inside the browser, refresh it. And now I can see we cannot do it left and right, but I can do it up and down. So this is something that is very important to point out here. Let's also go ahead and add a height, because I don't like using rows and columns. So let's go ahead and say we want to add a 200 pixel height. Let's make it 100 instead. Go back inside the website, refresh it, and now I can see it looks like this, and we can resize it if you want to. So with that, let's talk about the next input type. So if we were to go inside here, inside my form, I can go in and start by creating 2 breaks. So we actually have some distance between this text area and the next one. And I can create another input. Now this one is not going to be a text type, but a radio type. So in this case here, again, we need to go in and give it a ID. We need to give it a name, and we don't actually need to give it a placeholder because this is not really going to make sense in this one. And I'll show you in just a second. So I would copy the ID and the name. I'm going to paste them in here. The ID is of course going to be for a label. So we're going to go in here and add a label to this one. We don't actually want to add the label before because this is a radio type, which is where you can go in and select a circle. Typically in this kind of input, we want to do it afterwards. So I'm just going to do that. And we can actually ask the user a question. Let's say we're asking the user about an eye color. So the first tick mark that we want to create here is going to be for the blue eye color. And I can actually go and change the ID and the first name. So we're going to go in here and we're going to go ahead and say that this is going to be eye color blue, just so we have something here. I'm going to copy it, paste it inside my for. We're also going to go ahead and change the name. So in this one, we're going to call it eye color. Let's actually make sure we spell that correctly, eye color. And if I were to do this, go inside my website, refresh it, you can see that we get this little tick mark that we can tick off here. So what I can do is I can actually go ahead and add more underneath it. So I can go ahead and copy, paste it below. So we can, for example, say we have one for brown. And we also have one for green. And then we do also need to make sure we go in and change the ID. So eye color brown. And then eye color green inside the IDs. And of course, we want to change those inside the labels. So we have them correctly labeled. Now the names are going to stay the same because all these different radios here all belong together. So whatever the user picks here is going to be part of the eye color. So we need to make sure that whenever we grab the data, that we keep the name the same in all the inputs that belong together. So if I were to go ahead and save this, go inside the website, you can now see that if I were to select something here, because these all belong together, which is based on the name, they don't actually allow for me to pick multiple ones. And of course, you might want to have some text actually describing what is going on here. And in this case here, you could go in and just create a label. And just say we don't have a for, because in this case, it might not make any sort of sense. And I can call this one pick your eye color, and then go back inside the website, refresh it, and then you can see we have some text going on here. And again, you can always add breaks if you want to have them on the next line. So if I want to do that, I can always go in, grab a break, go right after the label here, add that in, go back inside the website, and then you can see we get a little bit of spacing there. So now let's say I went into this one and actually picked the value. How do we actually know what I picked when I send this data to the next page? Because right now we don't actually have a value that we set for this particular input, because for example up here, when I write something, this is going to be the value, but how do we know which one is going to be the value inside this one? The way we do that is actually by adding a value to each of these in here. So I'm going to add a value to all of them. And I'm going to write a value for each of these radios here. So if I were to go in and pick the blue eye color, this is going to be blue. If I were to pick the brown one, it is going to be brown. And if I were to pick the green one, it is going to be green. So now we actually have some values that get sent once we actually submit this form when we use this radio button here. And now we can also add another type of input, which is very similar to this one. So if I were to go in here and just copy this entire thing with the 2 breaks right before the label for pick your eye color and paste it down below here, we are now going to say that we can also ask the user what kind of pet they have, for example. So we can say, what pets do you have? Question mark. And instead of a radio type, I can actually go in and set this one as a checkbox. So if we were to say checkbox and copy paste that one down. And of course, we can change all the values. So in this case here, we don't want to have eye color blue for the ID, but we want to have, for example, a pet cat. And then we can copy that down inside the for, inside the label. Then I want to change the name. So we're going to change this one to pet cat. And then I want to change the value to become a cat. And then of course, inside the label, we want to actually tell the user what they're picking here. So in this case, it's going to be cat. So the next one is going to be a dog. We can also say that the name is going to be pet dog. And then we can also pick dog as the value. And we're just going to copy paste the dog down inside the label. Of course, this should also be pet dog, because that's what we did inside the previous one. So let's make sure we do that. And the same thing goes for the last one. So in this one, we're going to say the ID is going to be pet bird. And then we can also say the name is going to be pet bird. And the value is going to be bird. And then we can also change the ID inside the label and also change the name inside the label. So now because we added this as a checkbox, essentially, and that's basically the only difference here is that we just added a checkbox, and of course we had to change the data inside of it. If I were to go back inside the website, refresh it, you can now see that we get kind of the same thing, except we can pick multiple ones if we want to do that. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is going to be a drop down. So if I were to go in here and add these two breaks, so we actually have some distance between the previous inputs that we have, what I can do is I can go in and create a label. So in this case here, I'm going to maybe pick car type you own or something. Then I can go below, add a break, and also add a select tag. Because we use a select tag in order to include all the different drop-down list items inside this select tag here. So what I can do is, first of all, we can give this one a name. So just like before, when we have to grab the data on the next page, we want to make sure that this one has a name. So in this one here, we can call this one car type. So we have a type of name for this. We can also give this one a ID. So we can call this one car type and actually include that inside the label, inside the for. So we can add that in here. And then we can add any sort of listing inside the dropdown by adding the option tag. So we can just say option, add a value, and add a name for this dropdown. So in this case, if you could, for example, say Ford, and then you can also add a Ford as a value. That would actually be capitalized in this case here. Then I can copy paste this one, paste it down a couple of times. So we have a couple of options. I could say, man, cars have like difficult names. Mustang, we can say. I'm not a car guy. Mustang, we can add that in for both of these. Then we can also add in a Toyota. That's how you spell it, right? Toyota, add that in here. And by doing this, if I were to go back inside my website, refresh it, you can now see we have a drop down where you can select different car types. Now, of course, right now it's going to select Ford by default because that is the top option. So in a lot of cases, you might want to go in and say that you want to add a option at the very top here that is going to be called something like none and then none. You know, just so you have that option up there. So you haven't selected anything basically. So going back inside the website, refreshing, you can now see it says none. And then you can select one of the cars down here if you want to. So with that, these are all the different input types, but we do also need to actually submit this data because right now we have all this data inside the website, but how do we actually submit it? So in order to actually submit it, first of all, we're going to add two breaks to get some distance. And then I'm going to add in a button HTML tag. Now, some people might tell you to go in and add a input, or I know for a fact that I will get comments like that if I don't mention this. So if I were to create a input, you can actually create a type set to submit. Now, setting a type to submit inside an input is not really the best thing to do. Like there's a couple of downsides to it. So instead, what you want to be doing is you don't want to create an input, but instead you want to create a button and you want to go in here and actually set a type and set this one to submit. Again, there's nothing wrong with using an input or a button. It's just that it comes with a few more perks to do a button instead. So that is what most people recommend you do. For example, if you were to use the Bootstrap framework for HTML, they also recommend that you use a button instead because it comes with more perks. So it's just a thing that I recommend you do as well. Just use a button instead and just put it as a submit type. Inside the button here, I'm also going to go ahead and add a value, and I'm going to set this one to submit, just so we can actually grab this if we actually need it to. And for the button, you can just come up with any kind of text here. I'm just going to go ahead and write send data. So if I were to go back inside the website, you can now see that we have a button that we can actually click on in order to send this data. So if I were to write things in here, if I were to say Daniel, if I were to write something cool, pick my eye colors. So in this case, it's going to be blue. I have a cat, a dog, and a pet, because we do have that. I do also have a car, which is a Toyota. And if I were to send this, you can see we get sent to a page that right now does not exist because we didn't actually create it yet. But you can actually notice something here. If I were to go up inside the URL, you can see it says example.html. So that's the page we told it to send the data to, right? We don't actually have the page yet, which is why we're getting this error message. But the important thing here is that you can actually see that inside the URL, we get all the data inside the URL here. So you can see first name is equal to Daniel and message is equal to whatever I wrote and eye color is equal to blue and, so forth. So we get all the information inside the URL here. If I were to go back and instead I were to go inside my form and submit this using a post method. So I were to do that instead, go back inside the website, refresh it. Just going to write something here. And if I were to send this, you can see that now we have nothing inside the URL. So that again is one of the differences between using a post and a get method. So it is important to note that there is a difference there. Now, before we move on to the styling, there's a couple of things I want to talk about when it comes to these different inputs here, because these are very important to note. At least I think they're very important to know about. Some people inside my PHP course told me that whenever we send this data to the next page and we have to actually sanitize the data, which is basically when we go in and make sure the user submitted all the data inside the forms. For example, if we were to go inside the page here, let's say I left out my first name empty, and then I submit it. Right now we can actually do so. Okay, so using a programming language, we would actually go in and make sure that the user cannot send the data if there's nothing typed into one of these forms. So some users are telling me that there's no need to do that using PHP, for example, which is one of the programming languages you can use, because you can just go inside, for example, the input here and type a required attribute. Now, using a required attribute like this is going to do something. So if I were to go back inside the web page, refresh it, if I were to try and submit this form without typing anything inside the first name field up here, even though I added in a required attribute, if I were to try and send this, we get this little pop-up. And people have told me again and again and again in the comments that this is going to be something that can allow for you to make this secure, because people are not going to submit the data if there is a required attribute. However, you should never do any sort of security using front-end development, meaning HTML, CSS, or JavaScript if it's used for front-end stuff, because you can very easily bypass it. If I were to go in here and right-click this form and go inside my developer tool here, because this is something all browsers have. So if you just know a little bit about browsers, you can go in here and, oh, is that the required attribute I see right there? I'm just going to go ahead and delete that inside my developer tool here. Then I'm going to go back inside my website and I'm going to try and submit it again. Oh, it worked. I submitted it. So no. You cannot type required and expect that to be a security thing. The only thing the required attribute does is that allow for you to have a visual pop-up to tell the user that, oh, you forgot to type something in, but you don't use it in order to prevent hackers from accessing your website, okay? So don't use it as security. And again, you can add this to all the different inputs down here if you want to. Again, it's not wrong to use it. It's actually a very good idea to use it, but don't rely on it for security. That's the important thing here. Next, I'm going to copy paste this first input that we have in here. And I'm just going to paste it on the top here, add a couple of breaks just so we can tell the difference. And I'm going to say that this one is going to be a password that you're going to include. Now, whenever you do this, you can actually set a input type as password. And whenever you do that, it is going to hide away the text that you type inside this input here. Now, let's just go ahead and change these so it looks proper. So in this case here, the ID could, for example, be the PWD, which is password. We can also name this one PWD as password. And we're going to set the placeholder to password. And then also, of course, we want to take the ID, paste it inside the label up here, and save it. So we're going to go back inside the website. You can now see we have a password field, but when I type something, it is going to be hidden. And the same thing goes for an email. You can actually go in here and you can add the exact same thing. If we were to paste it down here, we can also go in and say that this is going to be an email type. So we can say email, and of course you could change everything else in here as well. I'm just not going to do that right now. Go inside the website, refresh it, and then it's going to check for an email in this case here. So if we were to write something here, let's write something in these as well, just to have something. Boom, boom. So right now, if I were to actually hover my mouse on this input up here, you can actually see that it says, please include a @ in the email address because it is missing a @. So right now it's actually checking, is this an actual email? If we were to try and submit this, you can see, oh, there's errors here. You need to write an actual email. So there is also a way for us to check if this is a proper email using a input type. So now, having talked about all these different ones, let's actually go and delete the password one. So we just have the first name one down here below. So it looks something like this. Let's go ahead and talk about styling. Because right now, if I were to go inside and actually include my reset style sheet, you're going to notice that things are going to go horribly wrong. So I would do that, go inside the website, refresh it. Uh-oh, things are disappearing. Now, the important thing to note here is that things are not really disappearing. It's still in here. You can still click them. You can still write. Of course, you can still see the placeholders. But the problem here is that by default, your reset style sheet is going to try and hide away a lot of the default styling. So we have to refix that inside our style sheet. So what I can do is I can show you how we can style and change all these different elements inside our form, because there's many different pieces of styling that you need to know about. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside my main.css. And as you can see, we do already have something for the text area. So whenever it comes to any of these text area or inputs, we can actually go in. I can say text area and input. I can actually go in and say that I want to include a border. So we can say we have a border. It is going to be 2 pixels. It's going to be solid, and we're going to have it be just a black color. So 111. So where to do that, go inside the website, refresh it. You can now see that we have a border. But something you're going to notice is that as soon as I click on one of these, nothing is actually going to happen. And when I say that, you may have noticed it previously. If I were to go back in and redisable my style sheet and also go and actually delete these CSS we just did, whenever I go inside the website, you're going to notice that whenever I pick something, it is going to create this box around whatever I selected. So you can actually see we get this little border when I select something. And this is actually an indicator to make this more user-friendly, so people actually know what you have selected right now. So that is also being removed. So that is something we have to make sure we add in. So if I were to make sure that everything is back like it's supposed to be. Now let's go and make this one pixel instead, and maybe a slightly lighter color. So let's say CCC. If I were to go back inside the website, you can now see that when I click it, nothing happens. So now we're back to where we just came from, right? So what I can do is I can create a outline and set this one to the exact same thing. So if we were to say 1 pixel solid, maybe let's not make this one gray, but make this one blue instead. What I can do is I can refresh, but you're going to notice something, which is that they're going to be blue by default. So whenever it comes to focusing a text input inside the website, we do have a pseudo class called focus. So if I were to actually copy these, paste it down below, and say that when I focus, by saying we have a focus pseudo class, then I want to turn the outline blue. So we can actually delete it from these 2 different pieces of styling. And we do also need to make sure we add the focus after the text area here. So with this, if I were to save this, go inside the browser, refresh it, you can now see that when I actually click on one of these, then we get this focus outline. So this is how you can customize the focus one. But now a really cool little trick I'm going to show you, which is something that you're probably going to think is very cool, is that you can actually go down and say, what if I want to target a particular input? Because right now, the reason that our radios down here do not have that little thing we can click in is because right now the appearance is not set to radio, and we need to do that. And that means that we only need to target any sort of input that has a radio type set inside the attribute. So inside our CSS, the way we can do that is by writing input, brackets, and tell it whenever we have an input that has a type set equal to radio, then I want to do something to it. So in this case here, we can set appearance and set this one to radio. Doing that, going inside the browser, refreshing, you can now see that now we have it again. And of course, right now we're getting this little border here when we focus it. And that's because, of course, if we were to go back inside this input up here, we do also need to tell it that it is only whenever we have a text type input that we want to focus. So saving this, you can now see that we do not have that focus, but we do have it up here. And the same thing goes, we can actually take the input, paste it down, and say that whenever we have a checkbox, then we want to do the same thing. So we can actually set this one to checkbox. Saving this, going inside the website, refreshing, you can now see we have the checkbox as well. Now we do of course also have a select down here that right now does not have a border. So what we can also do is you can go in and you can go down to the bottom, say we have a select, and we want to add a border to it. So we just copy paste in the border from the previous one up here, save it, go back inside, refresh, and then you can see we have a border. And of course you can change the width of it. You can change any sort of thing you really want when it comes to the HTML and CSS. So you can go in and say we want to have a width set to 200 pixels. Do that, go back inside, and then you can see it gets slightly bigger. And the last one we have down here is going to be the button. So right now we don't have any sort of styling when it comes to the border or the background color or anything for the button. So what we can do is we can say we have a button. We can pick a background color. So in this case here, I could say background color is going to be equal to, let's make it bisque. And we can also give it a border if you wanted to. In this case here, let's just not give it a border. So I'm just going to save it, go back inside, refresh, and then we can see we have a button down here. Now, a very popular thing that I like to do for all of these different ones, or at least the inputs, the text area, and the button, and the drop down, is that I like to add a padding. So whenever I go in here, what I can do is I can say that we have any sort of input that has a type set to equal to text, and any sort of text area, and any sort of select, and any sort of button. And what I want to do is I want to add a padding. So I'm going to say we have a padding set to 10 pixels. So if I do this, go back inside the website, you're going to notice that all the text is kind of like touching up against the side of all these different inputs. So it's like very close up against. And the same thing down here. So when I refresh it, you can see everything is getting a little bit of spacing. And it just looks a lot better, I think. And now you can also go in if you want to, and you can add a small border radius. Again, you can customize pretty much anything when it comes to boxes with these different things. So I can say border radius is going to be 10 pixels. If we were to go back in, refresh it, you can see we get rounded corners on all these different inputs and the button down here. We can also add a hover effect. So right now you can see there's no hover effect going on. So we're to actually grab the button here and say we have a hover. Then of course I can go in and change the color of it to not be bisque, but a slightly darker version. So I can go in, select it, and just kind of like decrease the color a little bit. And we're also going to go and add a cursor, because right now we don't actually have a hand icon when we go on top of it. So I'm going to say we have a pointer, save this one, refresh the website, and then you can see we get kind of like a button effect down here. And again, the same thing goes for the fonts. You can go in here and you can say, okay, so the fonts inside these different text areas and buttons and such, they should have a different font size. So we can say not font family, but font size is going to be, for example, 50 pixels. If I were to do that, refresh the website, you can now see that all the font sizes change and you can do any sort of thing to them. So really, you can do pretty much most things to these as you want to. But I think the important ones to note here are the ones that I've been talking about in the past examples here. Because, you know, knowing how to target a specific input that has a certain type is an important thing to know. Targeting the select input type that we have down here is important to know. And also how to do the focus, which we talked about up here. If you want to focus something, then change the color of it. So again, these are the important ones to know about. And just like that, we have a form. So with all that, that's how you can create a form, and you're going to be plenty of ready for the day when you actually start learning how to handle data that gets submitted by the form. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.